Hello, welcome to Narrative Tales, and in today's episode, I'll be interviewing Kyle K. Moore and his expertise in socioeconomic status. So,
Okay.
can you describe what you study and your area of expertise?
Sure, I will. Again, my name is Dr. Kyle Kilgore Moore. I'm an economist with the program on race, ethnicity, and the economy at the Economic Policy Institute. That is a think tank in Washington, D.C., where we do research that is to the benefit of working people and their families, particularly low and middle class folks and their family. I do work specifically on racial disparities throughout the labor market, and that entails differences in the unemployment rates, differences in wealth across households, and I do a lot of work on the intersection between public health and the economy. So the ways that folks' working conditions, the kinds of jobs that they have impact their health, and how the health of the population impacts the economy. So those are the sorts of things that I work on at EPI.
Right. How would you define socioeconomic status?
Sure. So socioeconomic status is a measure of a person's or household's material well-being, is how I'll describe it. And it really is used to measure how folks are able to participate in the economy and in society. There are a lot of different ways people think about SES, but a lot of times people use a sort of composite of income and wealth and education level and the kind of job that you have. But really all of those are kind of put together in SES to just give a picture of like where your economic well-being is. Sure.
So, when you say that it's like more of a big picture, do you think there's a very numerical or objective way to put socioeconomic status, or is it more like subjective?
Yeah, it kind of depends on what particular measure you want to use. So a lot of times when people are thinking about SES, they might use your share or what portion of the income distribution you fall into. So people will talk about income quintiles or whatever quantile you want to use. You can use quartiles, or people talk about the bottom 90% or the top 10% or top 1%. Like these are all ways of thinking about socioeconomic status. They can be numerical, but people also use, for example, think about education. They'll say, less than a high school diploma, some college. And so there are different ways you can kind of get at that idea. But there's not just like one, this is what SES is. It's really like a composite idea.
Yeah. So let's delve into today's main topic. How relevant do you think bias related to socioeconomic status is in today's society?
Yeah, if we're thinking about the U.S. in particular, I think there's a lot of bias around folks' access to resources, right? And a lot of that shows up in our government, in our welfare system, right? We have a system that is very punitive and biased against folks who are struggling in a lot of ways, and that's because of a lot of our history. The way that we developed our welfare programs and our social safety net is marked by a lot of, again, like punitive measures to try to make sure folks are attached to the labor market, or there's a lot of fear and, again, bias around this idea that folks will be lazy or taking advantage of the system in some ways, when very often, more often than not, it's folks who are struggling and need resources to be able to get back on their feet. But we put a lot of barriers up that makes it difficult for folks to access those resources. So that's a major way that SES bias can show up in our society.
Oh, yeah. So you mentioned the idea of lower SES backgrounds being like lazy. Where do you think these ideas come from?
They have a lot of sources. One is goes back to the founding of the U.S. and something called the Protestant work ethic. That's this idea that the Pilgrims, the folks who initially came to the United States, or like came to the landmass that became the United States, had this idea that you showed your worth to God and to the rest of society by the amount of work that you put in. And if you, the folks who have resources, have those resources because they worked hard to get them. That's the assumption, that's the idea, because they're ordained by God to have those, right? And therefore, folks who are poor don't have because they must not have worked hard enough, right? And so part of that is like baked into the American idea of what it means to be deserving of, merit, right? So that's part of it. The other part of it, unfortunately, has a lot to do with racial bias, right? In the 1980s, there were these ideas that were pushed around about like welfare queens, who were supposedly, Black single mothers living high on the hog on government benefits, which just didn't exist empirically, but it was a very useful idea for conservatives to use when they wanted to demonize social welfare programs, which they have problems with for lots of reasons, but namely because they're costly. They implied the need for raised taxes. They don't want that to happen. And again, it kind of circles back into this idea of like deservedness. And so that's where these ideas kind of come from in the American mindset. And it's important to keep those in mind when you see folks who are very biased against things that will help folks who are poor and struggling.
So like a mix of old beliefs and propaganda kind of form this general bias.
That's right.
What do you think are some common misconceptions that people tend to have about others from low socioeconomic status backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, one is the one that we were talking about just now, that folks are lazy, that folks don't want to work, for example, that they aren't, endlessly creative in how they make do with what they have. And I think another misconception that's pretty common is that they don't value or they don't have financial literacy, right? They're like, one of the issues is that they just haven't learned how to manage money. When in fact, folks who don't have a lot are actually fantastic at budgeting, right? They have to, right? And it's simply the fact that they don't have the income coming in that explains why they are poor. It's not that they aren't managing it well. It's just that they're being underpaid or not paid or not employed in ways that are fair, and have a lot of things stacked against them. So I think that's some major misconceptions there.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that a lot of the misconceptions are kind of like sort of guided towards this idea that lower SES backgrounds are lazy or have something wrong with them that makes it seem that way.
That's right. That is the very individualistic mindset that folks have, is that when folks are poor, it is because of something, as you said, something that is wrong with them and something they need to fix or adjust or learn, rather than things being stacked against them or being placed in a system that's often unfair.
Well, so what are some like real life examples you have seen of this type of bias presenting itself?
I think you can see it, quite often. I live in the DMV, and and I lived in New York for quite some time, and you will oftentimes see folks who are struggling and who, need support and are asking for support, on public transit and things like that, and folks will be treated very harshly and poorly or ignored, not being treated as human in those ways. That's a example that comes to mind. Others are, let's see. Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways that folks who don't have a lot just have to struggle to be included in certain social groups, social standings. And I guess the issue is that like so many things in the United States are gated by access to resources that it's not so much a like some of what I'm talking about is like the passive bias, the bias that you might see interpersonally, but there are so many places that are just like folks just can't go if they don't have access to a high enough income or a credit score or the social connections that come with, you know, higher education and things like that.
Like the system being built against them.
Exactly, right. So like that's the real bias. It's just kind of like not spoken so much, but it's just kind of present.
It is, yeah. Well, we hear a lot about different protections we have legally, like protections for racial bias, gender-related bias, religion. What type of policies are in place to help fight socioeconomic status-related bias?
Yeah, so there's an interesting policy that comes to mind with respect to housing. There are laws in DC and other places that prohibit form of payment discrimination, right? And so what that means is that if a person wants to get access to a housing voucher and they're using Section 8, right, to be able to access that, if they're trying to access housing, right, they want to apply for an apartment and they're applying for that apartment using a Section 8 housing voucher. In some landlords, right, might discriminate against that sort of person and say, oh, we don't want that tenant because of what they're using to pay, which is government provided benefit, right? As opposed to someone who is coming with cash or, you know, has some other form of payment. So there are laws that prevent that, right? Because that is a direct form of discrimination based on what someone's, you know, socioeconomic status is. I think that is the kind of policy that is important for folks to be able to get equal access to the necessities you need to live, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So also about policies, do you think there should be other policies added to help protect against this type of bias? And if so, what type of policy do you think should be added?
Yeah, let's see. I mean, I think that policies that, how do I want to phrase this? Another way that folks can be discriminated against is based on their credit score, right? And we know that credit scores are often related to SES for a bunch of reasons. And we also know that there are, of course, there are other kinds of biases baked into the determination of credit scores, but it's often very difficult to build credit without access to the assets that folks often use to do that, right? Like if you can't, you know, if you're not paying a mortgage regularly, for example, it's hard to build credit as opposed to, you know, many folks who are renting, that's not necessarily adding to your credit score in the same way. Right. So policies that both de-emphasize the importance of credit scores when trying to get access to housing and policies that allow other means of building credit, you know, like again, regular payments on, you know, a phone or an apartment or the sorts of things that folks with OACS have access to that can show trust, which is the thing that a credit score is supposed to show trustworthiness, you know. So those sorts of more creative ways of getting folks access to the resources they need, I think are the sorts of things that we need to combat SES discrimination. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So policies are one way to fight this type of bias. What about inside of our communities, like our school communities or our friend groups or other social circles that we are in? What can we do or what can we promote to help fight this type of bias?
Yeah, I would say just be mindful that folks come from all sorts of backgrounds and folks from all sorts of backgrounds have a ton to contribute, and to not put so much emphasis on the markers of, you know, SES that folks can have, like maybe someone didn't have the fanciest pair of shoes or they don't have the newest phone. Not holding that against their character, right? Treating them differently because they don't have access to this thing. just make sure to see everyone as human, right? Because you know, the resource you have access to don't determine whether or not you're a good person or a good friend. So I think those are important for folks to keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's true. On a much broader scale, what do you think people's beliefs or what people think of socioeconomic status? How do you think that's going to change as the newer generations start growing up into adulthood?
Well, I would hope that folks do become more compassionate, and that folks start to recognize that it's not all about how much money you have, or even how much education you have, or how much wealth you have, or your family has. Hopefully, folks can become a little bit less materialistic and a little bit more compassionate, right? And so that they can see other folks as, again, trying their best and just assuming the best of them, right? And that when folks are, say, for example, applying for access to healthcare benefits, right? Hopefully the newer generations coming won't inherently look at someone who doesn't have access to health insurance and say, oh, they must not have access to this because they haven't worked hard enough, or they don't value their health, or, one of these other, really negative reasons, and just say, oh, let me just trust that they need this, or let me just care enough about the fact that they and their family need this to provide this, and not, make them jump through hoops or make the process very onerous and difficult to get access to. Just make sure that people have the things that they need to thrive, and I think we'll all be better off that way. So hopefully that's where folks go. I would love to see that.
Yeah, me too. Okay. That's all the questions I have for you today. Thank you so much for letting me take some of your time for this interview.
Yeah, of course. I'm glad to do it. I'm glad to see folks interested in these topics, and hopefully this goes well for you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you for watching this episode of Narrative Tales. If you enjoyed, maybe you'll like some of my other videos as well.